one.
Hashtag Freethinkers.
Because you've never been the same as anyone else.
Don't think the same as everyone else.
This is your call.
Shouts out to all the people checking us out right now on Millennial FM 95.9 FM. Everybody checking us out on Facebook Live. Everybody checking us out on YouTube, Periscope. We we normally do our Get Your Playlist Right. We normally have all kind of guest interviews and things like that. Look out for Ezra and AJ and Dose and them. They'll be in the studio next week to do their show, Second Thoughts, where they highlight all kinds of Christian production and things like that, and music from all over the world, from London, UK, blessed music. But today is more important. We have the election, the midterm elections just happened, and we have a special panel here. We have from Watch Fox 57, we have Fraendy Clervaud, and he will introduce us to the rest of the panel as we discuss and take your questions about the midterm elections 2018 here in South Carolina. Fraendy?
Absolutely. David Pendergrass, thank you so much for that. Everybody, thank you once again for joining us for a special midterm election recap. I'm sitting with two guys here next to me that know exactly what they're talking about when it comes to all things election. We have to my right Trav Robertson, the chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party. Let's give it up for him, ladies and gentlemen.
Good to be here.
We also have John Parker, GOP strategist, traveling the world, making sure that people on the Republican side get their stuff together.
That's right. Thank you.
So we're going to get straight to it. Obviously, midterm elections, a pretty big voter turnout on both sides, we could say. So let's go straight at home first. We'll focus on the governor's race. We'll start off with you, John Parker. Once again, South Carolina going red. Is it a surprise?
Not a surprise to me. You know, South Carolina is a red state, and Republicans did turn out. There was a point where there was less enthusiasm, and ultimately you saw a lot of the similar type voters that came out in 2016 come out again. And as long as you go out and vote, South Carolina should stay red for now.
You know, Trav, according to the official results coming in from scvotes.org, it shows us that Henry McMaster received 921,000 votes. James Smith, 784,000 and some votes. There's still a big gap there. I guess some people may think, what do Democrats have to do to possibly win over South Carolina?
Well, I think in part it's all about setting expectations. I mean, you can't have a party that's atrophied over 8 years and then come in and expect to win everything. I mean, there are some bright lights. I think we saw the first transition from the agrarian counties like Dillon and Calhoun County start to make the solid transition to Republican, and you're seeing some Democratic growth in counties like Greenville. Henry's McMaster's margin in Greenville County was not what it used to be by a Republican candidate statewide. And I think if you'll look, Henry got fewer votes than any Republican on the ballot statewide. And so I'm not so sure that you didn't see a shift in rural counties now transforming themselves into the Republican base, and then some of our larger counties becoming or trending towards a Democratic candidate, which has happened all across America.
Is that something that the Republicans should be alarmed about? John?
Ultimately, the Democrats this cycle in South Carolina did what they needed to do, and they took a page that many places around the country did, which is a new Democrat that's more moderate, that's more pro-gun, still for some regulations, but more pro-gun than others, instead of being the more progressive, because James Smith hit a more moderate stance and appealed to more of those moderate voters as the parties are going through this sort of realignment period, and you have a different kind of Republican under a Donald Trump administration, and now there's a different kind of Democrat that's still feeling itself out.
So, Trav, is James Smith done?
I mean, I can't say that. I talked to him this afternoon. He was in a very positive place. Okay. In all modern terms, he's still a relatively young man. I mean, at 50 or 51, that's up to him. He's got to decide what he wants to do. We make our own future.
Absolutely. So let's move on over to something else here. On the ballot, there was a statewide constitutional amendment. We're talking about how to have the superintendent. There was on the ballot, either the governor could appoint the superintendent, or we could continue to what we're doing now, and that's we elect the superintendent. Well, now we're going to continue doing that. We'll be electing the superintendent. Trav, I start off with you with that. What does this mean by us continuing to vote for the superintendent?
I mean, first of all, it means that we won't have a Betsy DeVos appointed in South Carolina. You know, everybody made the argument that we wanted to have this person appointed so that there could be some type of accountability. But at the end of the day, I think people were concerned about that. People in South Carolina still value public education.
John Parker.
Sure, and I couldn't disagree more with my friend over here.
Is there agreement?
Ultimately, now we can elect a Betsy DeVos is what we can do, because what it means to the average voter in South Carolina is they still have a burden and they need to look down the ballot, because just in this past cycle, we have seen the Democratic Party go ahead and sign off on a person who was not qualified to be on the ballot and a felon. We have no qualifications for the position, and we have we've seen on the Republican side people run and nearly get elected who don't even have a high school diploma. And so there's a basic need. This also points to a lot of change that we're looking at. There's other government reforms that people have suggested, moving Secretary of State, for example, and making that an appointed position. The results of this election is going to make it harder for those government reforms and constitutional changes to take place.
What do you say to that, Trav?
I think first and foremost, the legislature needs to address, and I think Drew McKissick would agree with me, he's chairman of the state Republican Party, that the legislature has to define or give state parties the authority to not certify candidates. And if that were the case, then you would see some of these problems take care of itself. The flip side of that, I worked for Grady Patterson, who was a 3-star general, flew Mustangs off of Iwo Jima, who fought to stop imperialism and fascism in the world. And something he said a long time ago, he said, you should always be concerned when someone wants to take your right to vote away. And at the end of the day, that's something that echoes where we are in this country with the hyper-partisanship, and where we are with, whether you like Donald Trump or whether you don't like Donald Trump, where we are with what he is doing to the media and creating enemies of the state, I'm not so sure that I want to give the authority to the Republicans unless we have some more moderates in the General Assembly are elected.
Again, the biggest takeaway I have is I really encourage voters to not just look at who are they going to vote for governor in 4 years, but also who are they going to vote for down the ballot for things like treasurer and state superintendent, because it's a lot to keep track of, and it's a lot to ask for a person who has kids to take to soccer practice and
but you're asking people to you're asking people to give up voting because it's not efficient or timely in their life. That's a responsibility as an American citizen, is to go vote and take time to complete your ballot.
Parker?
All I'm asking is for people to look at the superintendent of education, make a good choice, because education is vital to our future.
Absolutely. That we can definitely agree on.
And Molly Spearman was one of the top vote getters on the ticket.
Yeah,
she really was. Let's switch
because
gears.
I ran her campaign
I
in full
disclosure. I'm trying to give
Full disclosure.
you some kudos there.
Yes, thank you.
Well, there it is. So let's switch on over to the Attorney General's. The Attorney General race here. Alan Wilson back at it again, defeating Constance Anastopoulos. Many people, John Parker, will look at this and say there's somewhat of a cloud over Alan Wilson because of the statewide corruption probe that's been happening. A number of Republicans have been indicted. What can we expect this time around, and how can the Attorney General distance himself from what people may think is a cloud over him?
I think it's an absolutely wonderful election result that the people of South Carolina have spoken and made it perfectly clear that Attorney General Wilson is vindicated. And the malicious attacks from a ambitious Democratic prosecutor who deliberately set out to sabotage and play politics with a bogus grand jury report full of lies and one-sided partisanship, a prosecutor who, yes, has been successful in somewhat bringing down some corruption, but very selective with those judicious powers, and has actually went so far as to seal the grand jury report up until the last 2 weeks of the election. It's really despicable and shameful, but the people saw through this charade. And this is also, it's worth noting, this is a prosecutor who was thinking about running against Attorney General Wilson and actually filed to become Attorney General, filed an exploratory committee report.
Trav?
I think that we've not heard the end of the investigation, and we would hope that the Federal Bureau of Investigations or the U.S. Attorney would look at what Alan Wilson did with no-bid contracts to potential candidates who might be running against him for Attorney General. You know, he authorized Charlie Condon to make some of those asks to some of his potential candidates, and I think that's something you're going to see over the next several months. So I'm not so sure. Listen, Alan Wilson's a nice guy. I like him.
Great guy.
I just don't think that either he was paying attention at the wheel when it comes to some of the ethical lapses. But at the end of the day, you don't get a report from SLED, not the special prosecutor, that mentions your campaign consultant is going to be the target of an investigation, and instead you get that guy to write a letter firing the special prosecutor. That's unethical at best, and it's malicious at worst.
John?
He didn't have the target of investigation to write a letter. That's bogus, and that's been debunked.
No, it's not bogus. It is not. He said he needed him to check the grammar.
Secondly,
well, my God, the University of South Carolina English Department's 4 blocks away.
The moment that he got the SLED report back, and the whole reason, what people forget, the reason that this investigation even exists is because our Attorney General decided to investigate corruption on Republicans. And when he got the SLED report back, he immediately turned it over to a special prosecutor, recusing himself of it out of an abundance of caution, even though he didn't have to, and turned it over to what ended up being a Democratic political partisan
But when
hack.
it started reaching into the depths of the corruption, he wanted to take it back. But let's make no mistake about this.
Because of partisanship. It's the same stuff they're doing at the national level.
Rick Quinn's name was in it. SLED's partisan?
No,
SLED's report was
I'm talking
so
about,
you're saying,
about
so let's be very clear. So let's be very clear.
The SLED report didn't say. The SLED report did not say
that Richard Quinn or Rick Quinn
SLED
would
report
not
did
be
not
targets
say
or mentioned.
at the point they were mentioned as someone that was interviewed, and out of an abundance of caution, he turned over the investigation at that point to a special prosecutor.
So they were at no point. Reports at no point. Us new information.
At no point. That's exactly what it says. Go look at the file.
So let's ask this: do you still think it's wise that Alan Wilson would give a no-bid contract to his previous law firm, where Richard Quinn's brother-in-law and son-in-law and Rick Quinn's brother-in-law works for the Ports Authority, or pay Rick Quinn's sister's company, where his brother-in-law is a registered agent, over $300,000 and some odd after they have been linked to almost every single bit of corruption in this state?
Oh, you know that's not true.
It is true. It's a fact.
You know how it works, and you're talking about 300.
Because
you're talking about $300,000.
Anytime he wants to give me a no-bid contract, and I'll take it. I'm ready.
Okay.
Attorney General Wilson, I will take this contract.
This is what I am not aware of, and I think, unfortunately, I'm sure the Democratic chairman here wouldn't be making up any information.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
But I am not aware of any no-bid contract that went to Richard Quinn and Associates. I have not seen a single report of that.
Alan Wilson's law firm, where Richard Quinn's son works.
Alan Wilson's law firm. Alan Wilson doesn't have a law firm. He's the Attorney General of the state of South Carolina.
Associates.
Okay.
That's
so Willoughby and Hafer.
Willoughby and Hafer.
You're attacking the Attorney General because a former employer has a relationship with his political consultant. I mean, this is this kind of like spidering conspiratorial craziness that people just have to shake their head at and say, okay, Alan Wilson's vindicated. I'm going to vote for him because we're sick of this nonsense.
Then why wouldn't we just let the U.S. Attorney or the Federal Bureau of Investigation sort it out?
General Wilson, I know for a fact, has asked for the U.S. Attorney, and there's been those investigations. And the U.S. Attorney has to, ultimately, the U.S. Attorney has to make that decision.
In 1986, Joe Wilson stood in front of the AT&T building and said, no-bid contracts are corrupt, they are immoral, and they have no place in the good old boy system. We need to they're part of the good old boy system. All I'm saying is this, is that at some point there needs to be a conversation as to whether or not he gave his old firm, who actually employs Rick Quinn's brother-in-law, Richard Quinn's son-in-law, a potential contract of up to $2 million to represent the Ports Authority. That's something that needs to be looked at.
We're going to have to look into, definitely. We're going to switch on gears on over. Let's go to the solicitor's race. All right, obviously from one, we could say, issue to another issue. Obviously, Byron Gibson defeated John Meadors by a landslide, more than 95,000 votes. Okay, so John Parker, 95,000 votes for a solicitor's race. That's kind of, what does that mean? I mean, what does that say of the voters of South Carolina, and particularly those here in Richland County? More than 95,000.
Well, first it says that there wasn't a Republican on the ballot, but second, that
Petition
does,
candidate was a petition candidate.
It was a petition candidate. That is a point to how hard it is to run as a petition candidate. But Byron Gibson ran a great campaign. He ran a great primary campaign, and the voters spoke very loudly and clearly that they want some change in what has been an ineffective solicitor's office there over the past few years, or several years even. With backed up case logs and everything, and said, "Where Gibson's the man."
So, Trav, where do we go from here?
I mean, I think John's 100% right. I mean, there's no question.
There had to be a point.
There's an agreement, ladies and gentlemen.
And as we mentioned off air, I mean, James Smith got 99,000 votes and Byron got 95. I think that's large for a countywide elected official.
Yeah.
And I think the voters spoke very loud and clear there.
Absolutely. All right, so let's break down something else here. Okay, we're going to switch gears, going down to the Low Country. The first congressional district, we're talking Katie Arrington and John Cunningham. John Cunningham was able to defeat Katie Arrington. For many people, Trav, they thought that was a surprise because you're talking about a seat that was Republican. Now it's been flipped. What does that mean for Democrats, and what did John do to make sure that he won?
Well, I mean, I think that you talked about him being a moderate. He ran as a moderate. He didn't run to the far
Joe
left.
Cunningham.
Joe Cunningham ran as a moderate.
Joe Cunningham.
John said, and I think he hit the nail on the head. He ran as a moderate. He didn't run to the left. He didn't run to the far right. And I think that he actually made offshore drilling a central part of his campaign. And for the first time, we saw that become a significant issue in a campaign. I'd never seen that before. I mean, I don't know. And that was something that transcended party line because people on the coast, they realize how important the coast is. They ran a campaign. I don't know that I was surprised. I wouldn't have been shocked or surprised either way because from what I understood, it was nip and tuck the entire time.
It was a very, very close election.
Right.
And it's worth noting that, you know, the Republicans in Beaufort and Berkeley and Dorchester won all the other counties except for Charleston County. And the race really came down to Charleston County, which is particularly where offshore drilling, for example, is a bigger issue because that's going to impact that tourism industry there, and that's a great fear for many of them.
Katie didn't see the margins of victory that a Sanford would have seen in a general election from Beaufort and Dorchester and Berkeley.
John, some people may look at this and say this is vindication because of some of the rhetoric that the president has been spilling over. Some people may say this is an example of how Democrats have come forward and now this seat has been flipped. What do you say to those individuals who think that way?
There's two ways to look at the first congressional district. You can either look at it and say, okay, this is about Trump, or you can look at it and you can go, this is about changing demographics and changing parties. There is a reality, as we've kind of looked and seen at the results of the election here, whether you're looking at the northern urban counties there in Florida, or you're looking at some of the urban counties around Atlanta or in Texas, you're seeing how a lot of these suburbs are starting to shift more Democratic as a trend. And had been lower Republican margins. Now they're higher Democratic margins. And Charleston is another suburb that you have a lot of. And we also have seen a lot of growth down there. And a lot of that new growth seems to be more liberal-minded than conservative.
Travis, what do you say to that? Do you believe it's just the differences or with the rhetoric that some people are concerned about?
I think it's just the changing of the counties down there. I mean, I think he's exactly right. You're seeing the growth. And let's use Patsy Knight, who lost.
Yep.
A lot of those folks who have moved in up to St. George, they used to live down in Goose Creek, which made it a lot. It was the conservative anchor of Berkeley County. And they're moving out because it's still close enough that they can go to Somerville, they can go to Bluffton, they can go to downtown Charleston. But the changing demographics are key to all of that.
Which mentioning Patsy Knight is a perfect example because basically all of the change that we saw in the state House legislature was mostly very little change, but all that we saw basically was in the first congressional district, and it's really seeing how that population.
It's a wash in the House, actually. Yeah. I mean, the Democrats started with a net negative with Mike Anthony. and then Patsy lost. It would have been a net -2.
Okay.
We took Crosby and Rivers out, so it's a push.
Yeah.
So you saw relatively any change with the exception of 2 folks. And I think that one of the things that benefited them is that they had a higher percentage of African-American voters in their districts than a Ben Pogue or a Cogswell or a Carroll Temple and a Peter McCoy. And so I think that you're going to see there was an extremely high African-American turnout in this election.
Let's transition over to the national stage for a moment here, okay? We've been hearing since the midterm elections that the House is now turned blue. There might be some millennials who may not have the election vocabulary down packed per se. So, Trav, I asked you last time, we'll start off with John Parker here. What does it mean that the House is controlled by Democrats in layman's terms?
Well, the Congress is divided into 2 houses, the House and the Senate.
Right.
The Senate has a longer terms, the House has every 2 years. Now that is, the House decides how much money we're going to spend on things. And that's their biggest, most important power. They set what the budget is. And as a result of that now they are able to deny President Trump's agenda because they can say, we're not going to fund this and we're not going to fund that. Now, there's checks and balances all over. The Senate plays an effect,
right.
And we had the Republicans had gains in the Senate. But this does make it very difficult for President Trump to pass any of his agenda without working with Democrats.
Travis, would this be, if Democrats do that and they kind of buck up against the president, what will that mean in turn? Do you think that people will start blaming the Democrats, or do you think that the president will try to work with them?
Oh, I think if I were a Republican, I would be extremely happy right now because we're stuck in the dilemma that they just got out of. I mean, losing the House for the Republicans, even though it may be short-term embarrassment, it's a blessing for them because they don't have to deal with the embarrassment of anything Trump does. So the question is are Democrats going to find things they can work with Trump on and move forward to show that they're able to do so, or are they going to immediately launch into some type of impeachment, or are they going to block everything here and there? And I am not in the leadership position there, so I do not know the answer to that.
Let's talk about that for a moment right there. He mentioned the impeachment. Some people have said, some Democratic leaders have said that possibly that impeachment proceedings could begin because of some of the things the president has done. John Parker, would it surprise you if you see something?
Well, again, I've seen the Democrats go out with their wild and crazy investigations. So
remember, the last impeachment in the last quarter century was done by Republicans.
Doing some wild and crazy investigations. But look, this is the thing. It's anybody's guess because the direction that the Democratic Party goes from here is really. I don't know that the leadership knows where they're going to go yet.
You're right.
Because you have, for example, O'Rourke, who ran against Ted Cruz and came very close to beating Ted Cruz in Texas.
Right.
He ran on let's go impeach. You had several women who were running for Congress, for example, who said, no, I'm not going to bring up that impeachment word and have gone very far away from that's the direction we want to go. And so it's anybody's guess as to whether you're going to have a Democratic Congress and partly who they decide to have as their leader, whether it's Nancy Pelosi or someone else. Depending on how they decide that,
He's going to get it in.
you're going to end up sitting there going, okay, let's just be as obstructionist as possible. Let's launch as many investigations as possible, or maybe a different version where they have to figure out an agenda because they ran this cycle on a pretty short list of things. No Trump and pre-existing conditions. And so going forward, they need to have a more full plan of how they want to move our country forward.
But we also are dealing with one thing that no one has seen yet, and that's the report from Mueller. We have no idea what that report's going to say.
So what does this mean now that the Democrats control the House?
Well, like I said, it means that we are in an unfortunate position, I think, from where the Republicans now sit. They're in the driver's seat.
We also haven't seen a President Trump. President Trump has an ability to shift. Again, this is a guy who used to be more or less a Democrat, and then he was a Republican, and now he is his own type of Republican.
And anybody who thinks he's stupid does so at their own peril.
Yeah, no doubt about that. And so that we don't know how President Trump is going to deal with a different dynamic now, where he has to go to the table with the Democrats, where before he did not have to. He only had to deal with his own party.
We have about 5 more minutes left of the show, but I'm going to try to see if I could get this into. Now that the Democrats have control of the House, what does this mean for our Congressman, Jim Clyburn?
Well, John tried to ask me who I supported for Speaker of the House. I mean, I want James E. Clyburn to be the Speaker of the House.
There you go.
That's who I want to be Speaker. I think
So it possibly between him and Nancy Pelosi?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think that he's running his whip, and there may be some positioning there in case the votes fall short.
Okay.
I'm not 100% familiar with all of that, but listen, if he had the opportunity to be Speaker of the House, I don't care if it were a Republican or a Democrat, we want the Speaker of the House to be from South Carolina.
And with that, there is definite real opportunity here with Jim Clyburn. Congressman Clyburn is one of the senior congressmen in the House. He is in a great position to move into leadership. And anytime you're in the leadership role, it's good for the state if it's from the state.
And you know, my good friend, I've got a good friend, Robert Cayley, and I were talking recently. We were just talking about how great it would be for South Carolina. I think that there are some Republicans that could support him over some other folks if they had a shot. You know, I just can't understate it or overstate it for that matter. It's
and especially
significant.
for the connections we could say for South Carolina, obviously with Nikki Haley on the national stage. You also have Governor McMaster, you have some other individuals, but if that were something to happen with Clyburn, I guess that'll be a good thing for South Carolina. We have about 3 more minutes, fellas. So let's wrap it up right here. What can we expect come January when the new Congress starts? Trav?
I'm not sure I know.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm being serious. I'm not sure.
You know, what the question is, to me, how much more change is there going to be over the next 2 years? Or are we going to see a whole lot more of the same? Because at the end of the day, while the Democrats took the House and the Republicans gained control, more seats in the Senate, and if you look at the numbers, 46% of the country voted for Donald Trump. 46% of the country voted for Republicans on Tuesday. Is anything changing? And we know that things are changing because the parties are changing.
Right.
And so how is that all going to shake out over the next 2 years? Not to mention, I know one thing will happen in 2020. The race for president will begin.
And I think one of the most interesting things to watch is going to be Dick Harpootlian in the South Carolina State Senate.
We didn't even touch on that.
That's going to be fascinating to watch.
Yes, that was arguably that's one of those things that I'm kind of like, great. This is great for us.
Popcorn and go sit and watch.
See what happens.
And for those of you who don't know, of course, Dick Harpootlian won that special election, this midterm. Obviously, he was taking over the seat that belonged to Senator Corson before. Obviously, the scandal with a state house corruption probe happening, he stepped down. Therefore, the seat was open, and Dick Harpootlian now has it. So that should be a very interesting. Dick Harpootlian used to also be the former South Carolina chairman of the Democratic Party.
Acerbic wit.
Yes.
Razor sharp.
He is a lightning rod for controversy. And also, I will say, as far as fascinating races, that was one of the latest called races. It was a lot closer than people expected. He's going to continue to have tough races because he outspent Dunn multiple times over, shut down caucus spending, and really still only barely got it.
I give credit to Dr. Matt Kisner and the Richland County Democratic Party for that win. They had boots on the ground, the absentee ballot chase. They did a good job.
Trav Robertson, chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party, thank you so much for being here
Thank
tonight.
you.
John Parker, GOP strategist, thank you for being here. We appreciate you tonight. And we are going to take it over. I think we have some questions from Facebook, if I'm not mistaken. Give me 1 second.
John's the one that really is going to
Yeah, we've got some questions. We've got some questions from Facebook here.
Okay.
Before we go to all the questions, everybody make sure to go onto Facebook Live and ask your questions. Everybody join us on 95.9. We're about to get off the radio here in a second.
Okay.
But we want to make sure that if you have some questions that you didn't have a chance to ask, learning a lot with the great dialogue here, that you have your chance to go on. Join us on Facebook Live. We'll be here about another 10 minutes or so and get your questions in.
So we're off the radio?
We're off the radio.
Okay. So
are we still live?
Yes.
Facebook
We are
Live?
still
Okay, we're
live.
still on Facebook Live.
So here's the first question.
Okay.
Jeffrey Johnson says, I've been in South Carolina for 13 years, 8 years under Obama and Clyburn, but nothing has changed in I-95 corridor, which is the poorest district in South Carolina and nation. I don't know who he's asking that to.
Okay.
So corridor of shame, I-95,
yeah.
so we could.
Well, that's one of those reasons we need to appoint the state superintendent.
John Parker, what do you say to that? You know, there's a lot of questions about that.
I will say that it's not, there's a lot of times people think that the congressman or the U.S. senator or the governor is directly to blame for any number of things. A good example for me is there's a bridge out right next to Congressman Joe Wilson's house. That bridge has been out since the storms. It is still not back up, and he can't do a darn thing about it. Wow. You know, it's as and this is a powerful individual, but some things are ultimately, that's a state and a private property issue, and there's nothing that you can do. Yeah. With the school system along I-95 in particular, the biggest problem we have is our state legislature as a whole not addressing the fact that we have a broken funding formula in this state for assigning education dollars. It is based off of an agrarian system, an agrarian economy that no longer exists.
That's very accurate.
And what we've done is decade after decade, we put another Band-Aid over, another Band-Aid over, another Band-Aid over it, because nobody actually wants to deal with all the political difficulties of reforming the entire funding formula, which is what needs to be done.
And I'm going to say that, first of all, there's a Republican, Tom Rice, who represents that area now. But at the end of the day, John is spot on. But there is a significant problem, and that is Act 388. The Realtors Association and Nick Kromitis got this bill through the legislature, and it changed the way we fund schools. But most importantly, it was one little change in there that said no school district will receive less in the current fiscal year than they did in the prior fiscal year. And that was a promise that could never be met. Yeah. And so what you're seeing is it's not only amounted to tax increase after tax increase on the local level, it's also limited the manner by which we can fund education in this state. And, you know, in times of bad economic circumstances, a sales tax is not going to be enough to pay the promise of creating schools. And what Democrats have to be very careful of is if we don't figure out a way to solve this, you're going to see more charter schools and more what they originally called white flight schools back in the 60s and 70s pop up to try and offset the needs that aren't being met.
And do you think, with that, we're talking education, because here in South Carolina, that's one of the major issues. You know, we've had the Abbeville situation there, they had the lawsuit there, a lot of people back and forth about education is not where it should be. Will we start seeing an increase in homeschooling possibly? Is that something that we're going to start seeing, that, you know, from charter school, people start getting out of public schools?
Yep, which we've seen.
Yeah, I think you've seen it. The question, I would take it a step further, is whether or not you're going to see public school resources thrown into homeschooling programs.
Yeah, which we do have issues here of, we have a teacher shortage crisis, part of the reason for that crisis, and there's a whole bunch of reasons. If you sit down with teachers, it's not just about teacher
classroom
salary.
sizes, it's politics in the classroom, it goes on.
Whole ton of stuff, discipline in the classroom, I mean, a whole other thing, support.
My mother taught school for 48 years, and she said the day I can't discipline a student in my classroom is the day I quit. Wow. She threw a student off of her debate team. The superintendent called her and said, I need you to put this student. My mother said no, and the superintendent forced her to do so, and my mother handed in her resignation the next day.
And that's one of the problems. That's one of the problems is teachers in this state, and I think across the country largely, but in this state for sure, do not feel fully supported in their efforts to teach. I agree. And so we've got to address that.
And they're living the life of not just teacher, but parent and guardian and supervisor and counselor. And they're woefully underfunded.
Yep. This person here says South Carolina has not funded public education for years. We've had almost 20 years of Republican leadership. I believe we touched upon that. How about the Herald? Here's another question here. Can the Republican and Democratic Party ever work together to get the best outcome for the country?
Yes. I'd just like to say I'm glad that you brought this up, because one of the interesting things that you saw in the exit polls for the election is that working together was one of the top issues for both Democrats and Republicans. You have, for every single time a Democrat goes, man, look at the neo-Nazis and the bigots over here, you've got You've got people that go, the Republicans going, look at Antifa and rioting over there. The hatred exists on both sides, and increasingly our parties became more of a polarized blood sport. It wasn't always like that. You can go back to the 80s, for example, Reagan and Tip O'Neill working together to accomplish important things for the country. And my hope is that sometime soon we will see more compromise and civil discussion.
So
Trav?
the first call I made Wednesday morning after Election Day was to Drew McKissick. I picked up the phone and I said, listen, I didn't get a chance to talk to him, but I left him a message and said, congratulations. Okay. Y'all did a great job. You won your races that you needed to win. But most importantly, I'd like to talk to you about 2 or 3 legislative matters that I think we can work together that would benefit your situation and my situation. So at some point we've got to realize, listen, I'm chairman of the Democratic Party. I'm going to be chairman of the Democratic Party for another several months. I'm going to fight every single day for my candidates to get elected.
We have a question coming from
But I'm
Michelle.
still a South Carolinian and an American.
There it is. From someone named Michelle to the GOP strategist. What is McMaster going to do to support teachers educating our children, and arming them is not support?
Well, I can tell you one of the reasons that I did support the appointment amendment is because what Governor McMaster at least can do is say, well, that's the superintendent's responsibility, which is if he had was in charge of appointing the superintendent, they could no longer kick the can. And right now, that is a problem that we have in education, is just a ton of finger pointing and no one taking responsibility, because when everyone's accountable, no one is responsible.
Well, and I think that's unfair to Molly Spearman. I think the truth is that Molly Spearman and Inez Tenenbaum always accepted responsibility. You know, when Inez Tenenbaum took over the Allendale public school system, it was an extremely unpopular move. Molly Spearman has done some of the same things. They have taken responsibility for the roles that they have, and they've done the best they can. I think probably what it boils down to is they don't necessarily get the legislative support to do some of the things, and that's why they're aiming for it to be appointed.
Which ultimately, to get off that, because that's a lost cause at this point. So,
that's right.
Well, what we've got here is that there are both pay increases, and one of the things that the state superintendent has been reaching out to do that she'll be sitting down and talking with Governor McMaster about is looking for more community involvement, speaking to our faith community and getting them more involved in schools, because ultimately a lot of these problems do start to sort themselves out some if the communities go into the schools and take ownership of their own schools, because the teachers then feel it's not just not feeling support from the top, but it's also not feeling support from the community.
It's like having a church in a community, and the church doesn't communicate with anybody in the community, and all the parishioners come from different parts of a city. Yeah. You know, the fact is people have to take ownership of their schools. They have to take ownership of their communities, and that's something that we've got to make sure happens.
I think this one will be addressed to you too as well, John Parker. What is McMaster doing about affordable health care in South Carolina and the dismal care seniors get right now?
I can tell you what he's not doing. He's not expanding Medicaid, which would give 400,000 people access to health care. Coupled with, it would take the stress off of our hospital systems that are forced to treat anybody who comes through their doors.
John Parker, some people may look at that and some people may wonder why isn't it South Carolina, expanding Medicare? What's the issue? Some people may say on the Republican side, it seems as if some may not want to.
We have to fund education, and we have to fund the roads that are crumbling. And by the way, we had buses burning down last year, so we got to keep our kids safe.
But the governor vetoed the funding for those buses.
And so as you go down the list, right, there's a problem of there's only so many dollars, and so where do all those dollars go? And one of the problems with Medicaid expansion is, as far as to any federal dollars coming down from it is a bait and switch. It is a con job from the federal government and the Democratic Party to force the state of South Carolina to explode their budget further.
That's just simply not true.
The chairman here,
Henry McMaster would prefer that your tax dollars that you've already paid fund the healthcare system in North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Massachusetts, Virginia, California, and Texas. The fact is that you would not even see a dime for the first 5 or 6 years this program is in place. But this is what this
First
is.
5 or 6. See, that's the switch.
But here's the case. But you're forgetting, it was Ronald Reagan, that Republican that is as close to Jesus Christ as any Republican can get, that said all public nonprofit hospitals must treat those who come in their doors.
And they still are required to.
Medicaid was the promise by which we would use and pay for that.
They are still required to. That's still a law that everyone has to be served.
But there's no way to pay for it. In 2016, Greenville, the hospital system, which is the largest employer.
I think he said there's no way to pay for it. That's the problem.
But expanding Medicaid is the manner by which we
talk about
here's
that.
the thing.
You just got done talking about how the real estate lobby had put in Act 388 and they said, oh, we're going to go promise that we're going to keep the fundings at this level, but we can't do it when we had a recession, so on and so forth. And so basically what you're asking and what you're arguing for, while you complain about that on this hand, you're trying to set us up for the same thing, only a much bigger bill. On the other hand, where you're going to say, okay, we're going to go ahead and fund all of these people, everybody's health care.
But you're assuming that everybody listening and everybody on Facebook Live doesn't understand one simple fact. They're already taking that money out of your paycheck and sending it to Florida or North Carolina or Georgia. That money is already accumulating in a pot and being sent to other states. And look at it. Look, in 2016, the Greenville Hospital System, the largest employer in Greenville, South Carolina, spent $179 million paying for the underinsured and uninsured, which is as large as either the city or the county's operating budget. There's a reason that Henry did so poorly there, because the businessmen who sit on that board, they understand the stress. There's no reason that the Greenville Hospital System and the Richland County Hospital System had to merge.
We have
only
one more
because
question,
of this.
fellas, coming in.
I just want to point out here real quick that a lot of people don't understand, because a lot of people think, well, we spend so much money on defense spending in this country, right? That's like, they'll think that's the biggest thing. What they don't understand is that every single dollar of discretionary spending that the federal government spends, every single dollar, could be times by 2, and you still wouldn't add up to the amount of money that we spend on solely Medicaid and Social Security in this country. That is because they take that part of the budget. This is what Democrats like to do. Oh, we're just not going to talk about the fact that we already are spending billions upon trillions of dollars on healthcare in this country, and let's go ahead and keep expanding it. At some point, there literally isn't any money there.
And the fascinating part about it is this, is that the Republicans have controlled Congress, and they've controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House, and the deficit of this country is spiraling out of control.
And that's because of entitlements.
Oh,
entitlements were starting all the way back with FDR.
Bullshit.
Starting all the way back with FDR, they said, guess what? This is how much money you're going to spend on healthcare, no matter what. And that's exactly what they're trying to do with the Medicaid expansion. Is say, hey, this is how much you're going to spend on. It's an uncontrollable cost that you're going to have to keep paying into the future, even when you can't pay it.
The deficit of this country accrued under 3 Republican presidents, Reagan, Bush, and now Donald Trump. Donald Trump's tax cuts for the wealthy are the reason that we have the highest deficit that is unsustainable.
The reason for the highest deficit is because of a Ponzi scheme that was set up by FDR with Social Security, and that every politician, Republican and Democrat, every politician, Republican and Democrat have been stealing.
We got one more question. All right, fellas. We got one question here. All right, so when they passed, someone's asking, when they passed the education law in South Carolina, wasn't a portion of that money supposed to fund school buses?
I think they went back to try and change the law to do that.
That's a very good question.
That's a good question.
Because that was the primary reason that Henry McMaster originally vetoed the bus funding. What he was saying is the education dollars that were from the lottery were supposed to go specifically to education, and he was trying to tell the legislature that you need to come up with new additional money for the buses, not take money from the regular school system.
Oh, right. Okay, so everybody wants the conversation to keep on going. So let me ask. There's some more questions coming in. We'll be here for like another few minutes here. Let's see here. Let me see. We're trying to get some of these questions here in. David Pendergrass, I don't know if you see anything that stands out. Let me know.
Let's see here. What does it say? If you say we do not have the money, healthcare in South Carolina, then why give huge companies a free pass for taxes? We can no longer give the wealthy people or corporates a free ride. That's from Pamela.
I'm not 100% sure. I'm guessing you're talking about the corporate tax cuts most recently. It's important to note
that's what it sounds like. Huge companies a free pass.
The most recent corporate tax cuts that Donald Trump passed, President Obama even recognized that the corporate tax rate in America was entirely too high. He supported lowering the corporate tax rate. We were the third largest corporate tax rate in the world, behind Puerto Rico, which I'm not quite sure.
I don't understand that.
I've always wondered. It seems like that would be second, right? Anyway, but third largest.
Which is part of the United States, everybody.
Yes,
Puerto Rico. Just so you all know, they are U.S. citizens.
Yes, and they have a different. They have a different set of different set of taxes, but. But ultimately, that high corporate tax rate has been putting the American worker at businesses at disadvantages. That has then been leading into putting the American worker at disadvantages compared to the rest of the world. And that's again why even President Obama, now they thought different levels. Don't get me wrong. Agreed that we had too high of a corporate tax rate. So there's some magical point here on the scale where it's better for everybody to have the taxes at this rate. More from the corporations actually hurt everybody.
And I think it was also in part playing with the global economy,
Yes.
so that you would entice companies to stay here instead of going to Mexico or Canada or other parts. So I mean, there were a lot of factors, but there's no question about that. They're going to always moderate the corporate tax cut.
We're going to round this off. We're going to end it with this question here. Obviously, the failed nuclear project in Fairfield County, 5,000 people losing their jobs. There's back and forth with the commissions about what to do. So the question is, what is ultimately going to happen with SCANA, SCENG? What needs to happen?
I don't think the voters care. If they had, they would have voted against the Republicans. I mean, Bill Sandifer, for example, who is propped up by Duke Energy, is supporting a 12% increase in rates for the power bills up there that came out this week.
So will we get? People are asking, will we get our money back?
Well, it's my understanding. Dominion has since said they don't want to do the $1,000 rebate that they had initially. So I don't know. Maybe John, you've got.
I can't tell you for sure where the legislature will go with it all. I know that Governor McMaster has made very clear that he wants money to be returned to the ratepayers, but Governor McMaster also has to realize that there's many difficulties with this because ultimately, there's one thing I know, and I think every ratepayer agrees on, that we want to keep our electricity too. And so ultimately, somebody's got to run the electricity,
and they're going to cut my
we've
power
got
off
them ripped off.
That's
right. And so, and we ultimately need to find the best deal for the fact that, and it's really not right that the ratepayers of South Carolina got screwed. They got hosed on this. Even if it wasn't the intention at the get-go, which I honestly believe at the get-go that was not the intention. It somewhere along the line became that,
right.
And they totally got hosed. And at this point, it's all just trying to figure out the best solution we can come up with that keeps the lights on, keeps people and with their jobs, keeps SCANA in control of the South Carolina people.
And remember,
SCANA
is a monopoly,
gets as much money back.
And there were certain requirements that obligations they had to fulfill in South Carolina to be that monopoly. One was, it used to be, most of your listeners may not know, they were required to pay for the Columbia bus system. And then, in 1992, Mayor Bob made a deal that eliminated Bob Coble. I don't remember what the specifics were, but it was in 92 or 93. There's some deal happened, and they decided they would move. across the river, and they no longer were required to pay for the bus system.
All right, fellas. Trav Robertson, chairman of the South Carolina Democratic Party. We also have John Parker, GOP strategist. Everybody listening to Freethinkers Radio. Everybody on Facebook Live. We appreciate you all. Thank you so much for tuning in for this special recap of the midterm elections. I am Fraendy Clervaud, the moderator for tonight from Watch Fox News. Make sure you all tune in tomorrow morning on Good Day Columbia, Monday through Friday. For all the news you get from 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., it's the Midland's only local 4-hour morning show. Make sure you do that. I appreciate it. Thank you, Freethinkers Radio, for allowing me to come on and for allowing me to be a moderator. We do appreciate you all. Everybody, have a blessed week.
Thanks.
Thanks.